What would you say is the most important battle in history? The Battle of Midway, perhaps where the Japanese Navy was turned back from invading America. Little war, sort of a spat they had going on, called the War of 1812. It was not a particularly bloody conflict. There was only one real major battle, the Battle of the Thames in Canada in October of 1812. Then there was the Battle of New Orleans, which is what we're here to talk about today. As we mentioned earlier, there hadn't been any major fighting since the Battle of the Thames in October of 1812, and even that was up in Canada. The last major engagement between American and British forces was the Battle of Lake Erie in September of 1813. On December 23rd, they received word that the British had landed a large force near the mouth of the Mississippi River. General William Jackson, commander of American forces in the region, decided to pull his troops together near the city of New Orleans, which was basically undefended by the U.S. at the time. Of their total strength of about 6,200 men, less than half were infantry. The British did have a significant advantage in artillery though, with 37 pieces to the Americans' 18. Leading the British was Lieutenant General Sir Edward Peck, who had been given overall command of British forces in the region. They dropped anchor, and men began swimming toward the shore, dragging scaling ladders with them. The rest fell back to their ships and began to retreat down the river. British artillery continued to bombard the American lines as they however, killing and wounding several American soldiers. American artillery returned fire, but without the same effect. A few made it to the American lines, but were cut down by American bayonets. Others were shot or killed by artillery fire. The battle itself lasted only a few hours, but the fighting essentially ended the war in North America. In fact, news of the battle was what eventually led to the end of hostilities. One American account claimed that a British soldier swam underwater from one boat to the next after his first vessel was sunk by American artillery, only to be killed by an American sharpshooter. Once he reached his new boat, they stopped any further attempts at offensive operations and began looking for a way to end the conflict. The British losses were far heavier. Just under half of their men were casualties, a total of about 2,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. We hope you enjoyed learning about this conflict that should never have taken place. Thanks for watching. This was, by far, the worst defeat of the war for the British and one of the largest victories for the Americans. It helped cement the reputation of both General Jackson and the United States as a whole as a major player on the world stage. Shortly after the Treaty 2 and the war was signed in Europe, news of it finally reached General Jackson, who promptly laid down his arms. Under him was Major General Samuel Gibbs, who had experience commanding troops in India and was known as a daring leader. Gibbs would wind up being killed in the battle that followed. He also requested support from Commodore David Porter, who was patrolling the Gulf of Mexico with a small fleet of warships. The American position ran along a canal that protected the eastern edge of the city. These were filled with troops who would attempt to storm the American breastworks. When they got close enough, the order was given for the British infantry to charge. For the next 30 minutes, the British soldiers ran toward the American lines, firing their muskets as they went. This was something of a novelty for the American soldiers, who had mostly been used to fighting from behind trees and buildings in skirmishes rather than in open battle formations. Their defenses were made up of breastworks, mostly constructed of dirt, logs, and whatever else the Americans could scavenge. American artillery opened fire on the British as they approached, forcing them to slow down their advance. The British responded by opening up with their own artillery. What was happening in the interim was mostly skirmishing and small raids along the frontier between the two countries. But when it comes to the battles, they are separated by more than 3 months and 1,000 miles. They set up a camp near what is now the city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The British objective here was twofold. First, they wanted to capture New Orleans, a prize that would stick it to the Americans and give the British a major port city in the Western Hemisphere. Second, they wanted to force the Americans out of West Florida. At the time, there was some dispute between the two countries over the exact boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase, an issue that would have to be settled later. But the British hoped to use the war as an excuse to simply take more land from the still somewhat inexperienced United States. How about the Battle of Hastings, which saw the Norman conquest of England and changed the language, culture, and history of an entire nation? January of 1815, the United States and Great Britain had already agreed to end their little disagreement through the Treaty of Ghent. Jackson's force, known as the Army of the Gulf, consisted of about 4,500 men. Only about 2/3 of them were infantry, however, with the rest being artillerymen, cavalry, and other support troops. There were also about 3,000 untrained civilian volunteers that swelled the ranks of the American army. Their commander, General Jackson, was a veteran of several previous conflicts, including the Revolutionary War. His second in command was none other than future President Andrew Jackson, who was known as much for his love of a good fight as he was for his political career. This treaty, signed on Christmas Eve of 1814, basically said that nothing had happened during the war and everything would go back to how it was before. It was ratified by both the US and British governments and then sent off to be ratified by the British Parliament. Or maybe the Battle of Stalingrad, a brutal urban conflict that marked the turning point of World War II. You could just turn on the or check your phone to find out what was happening in other parts of the world. In fact, if you wanted to know something that happened across the Atlantic Ocean, you had to wait until somebody who knew about it got on a ship, sailed across the ocean, met up with another ship whose mission it was to deliver that news, and then waited for them to sail to your port. So while the treaty to end the war was signed in Europe in December of 1814, it didn't actually reach American shores until February, 2 months later, right around the time that the battle we're talking about today was being fought. All great answers. But how about a battle that happened after the war was a part of it already ended? Welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be taking a look at the battle that happened after the war ended. It all took place in January of 1815. The United States and Great Britain were engaged in a UK. So why do we call it the battle that happened after the war had already ended? Well, because it was. There was just one problem with this. See, news in those days was not exactly instantaneous. But let us rewind a bit and see how these two opposing armies found themselves facing each other in the first place. Then in December of 1814, 3 British regiments under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Edward Pakenham arrived in the New Orleans area. American commanders knew that an attack was coming, but they weren't sure when or where it would happen. On January, the British began their advance on New Orleans. The British, meanwhile, were also short on foot soldiers. The British advanced on the Americans from the east on the morning of January. As the British got closer to the American lines, they began moving in smaller boats that were better able to navigate the narrow canal. Meanwhile, the British assault boats were approaching the American breast. By mid-morning, the British assault had failed. Most of the British infantry were dead or wounded. The Battle of New Orleans was one of the last major engagements of the War of 1812, a conflict that spanned from June of 1812 to February of 1815. When the British heard about the massive victory the Americans had achieved at New Orleans, they realized that things weren't going well for them in the war. In total, the Americans lost about 13 or 14% of their men during the battle, either killed or wounded. So, there you have it, the battle that happened after the war had ended.